Okay, so someone was having a good go with a spoon and a cup. So I will find that person who's got a spoon. Who has got that spoon in a cup? Ian, is it you? No, because you're on mute.
You might have heard my wife in our kitchen.
Oh, okay, right. I've also found that my live stream is also coming in my other ear. Right, good. Okay, here we go. Welcome to Perceptions Today. It's UK date 30th of June 2022, Zoom chat 41, with returning guest Laird Scranton discussing root dynamics of energy and how they emerge, part 2. Remember, we are recording this for the Perceptions Today podcast, and we're also streaming live to YouTube today. So keep in mind and do not divulge any private information. Again, I can edit it out if you divulge it for the podcast. But just remember, Perceptions Today looks into consciousness topics in all different areas. I'm your host, Paul, and your co-host is Ian D.W. Hawkins. Say hello, Ian.
Hello, everyone. How are you all doing?
And just to quickly tell you about the upcoming events that we have, there are some in the actual scenes before the next event. They're being organized, but UK date 12th of July, Anthony Peake will be joining us, and we will be doing 2 sessions on that day, 9 a.m. to 11 a.m., then 3 to 5 p.m. UK time. That will be talking about his latest book, Cheating the Ferryman, and that will be in Twitter Space. And if you want to see any more events which are actually coming up, go to perceptionstoday.com for the events list, the mailing list, the YouTube different channels which we have, one for community, one for ourselves, also Instagram, etc. To help us reach more people with questions, who have questions, I should say, and also have experiences and are researchers, etc. Subscribe to the podcast, YouTube channels, and other social media, comment and like, and tell people about what we're doing if you find it of interest. So what we have also is guidelines that you will have seen when you received your invitation. My favorite one, be civil to all, keep on topic, and use family-friendly language. You will get 2 opportunities to mess up with the family-friendly language, but we will tell you. Main reason is because I don't want to do so much editing. 2, when you speak for the first time, if you want, you can give a 30-second introduction and a brief question, and keep the kind of information down to 3 minutes or less. 3, when it comes down to announcements, either Ian or myself or yourselves will contact us. We will tell you what's going on and how we're trying to rectify these. You can either send them in the chat box here in Zoom, or you can actually send them via YouTube, and we'll try and look at that page at the same time. And what we will also do is, if we get too far off topic, I will try and bring you back. If everyone starts fighting left, right, and center, I'm definitely going to use the mute button. Then if you have any problems, as I said, just DM us and we'll try and sort everything out. We do have reaction buttons here in Zoom. And if you've not been using them for the first time, what you'll find is there's an option to put the hand up, which we'll use to see who wants to ask questions. We note down the kind of order to make sure everyone gets that opportunity to have their topic answered, or just bringing it back together again. Also, on the icons, you will see a waving hand. We use this for hello. We use a thumbs up for agree. We use laughing face for when I go wrong and everybody else does. And we also have a surprise face for when we cannot speak. That's what I'm going to be using it for. Again, some people are traveling and they've told me that they can't actually do that. So that'll be one of the things. Use the heart for when you love things. Use the confetti for a wow moment, and raise your hand for when you want to talk. If you like the content being discussed, you can leave a comment on Perceptions Today Twitter account, or subscribe to the podcast, as I've said before. Want to be involved with this account and the people that are in here. I will also be mentioning the people that come into the environment about what their specialities are, whether you should be following them or not, and where the best places are to actually find them. And this, I find, is the way that we like to work, is that we reinforce other people's information and connect together to try and connect more dots together. So what I would like to say is welcome to Laird Scranton, and it's over to yourself.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I always enjoy discussions like this with intelligent, interesting people who have their own they bring their own backgrounds and their own information, their own points of view to things. At any point during this discussion, if you have a question or you want me to clarify something, feel free to interrupt. I think it's a lot more productive a conversation that way than trying to hold it till the end. Discuss it in the moment. For those of you who aren't familiar with my work, I'm the author of more than a dozen controversial books on the subjects of ancient cosmology and language. And cosmology is the conception that a culture has of how creation comes about. And the ancient cultures I work with, my entry point is a modern day African tribe called the Dogon from Mali in Africa, whose culture is sort of an umbrella over several different ancient traditions. And when they use the term cosmology, or they use the term creation, what they're talking about is how matter formed, how the universe forms, how biological reproduction happens, and how consciousness comes about. And the Dogon say that their system is scientific. They say that they're symbolic. They see parallelism between these themes, and they see the themes as being so parallel that, in fact, they end up describing all four themes simultaneously using a single progression of symbols. That's one of the reasons why each symbol can be a little tricky to get your arms around meaning, because each symbol carries meaning for each of those four themes. The Dogon say that their symbolic system describes how matter forms. And the easy entry point for me with that was that I could see that they had correctly described an atom, and they correctly described the components of an atom, and they included a cosmological drawing to support those descriptions that was an accurate representation of an electron orbital shape. So starting at the very sort of topmost view of all this, I could see that there was a potential here that the rest of the descending structure might also be scientific. And so I've spent the last couple of decades trying to investigate whether it is scientific, and then trying to demonstrate how it is scientific in intuitive ways. Now, in retrospect, what the system is trying to do, what whoever put the symbolic tradition together, what they were trying to accomplish was essentially to reduce fractions. We're starting with what might appear to be complicated concepts of that relate to how matter forms, how space expands, how time happens, very central issues of creation. But the process is one of trying to reduce fractions down to a point where we have a workable set of things to get our arms around. As it turns out, the system comes down to a single cluster of dynamics of energy that repeat in parallel on all upward scales from the microcosm to the macrocosm. It doesn't matter which scale we examine it on, because it's the same set of dynamics of energy. What one of the sets of perspectives we have to work with is dimensionality. If we look at a concept or a dynamic of energy from a four-dimensional point of view, we're going to see it in a lot more detail than if we look at it in a root energetic point of view, where all the dynamics are simplified. So there are advantages to looking at any stage of this scale, because each level provides us with a view of things that's a little bit different, that provides us with another set of facts of what we're understanding. But in the end, it boils down to it ends up being very simple. Even though the public traditions of ancient cultures represent that these are processes that are fundamentally unknowable, when you get to the bottom of what the Dogon are saying, and when you get to the bottom of the esoteric Buddhism, it's flatly represented that these are completely understandable processes. So I'm going to try to lay it out, the key issues out in terms of matter first, how matter forms. The book I'm presently working on is now, the focus of it is to demonstrate how these same energetics intimately apply to concepts of biological reproduction in very much the same form that they apply to matter. The system begins with a philosophy called Samkhya in India, which is a companion to yoga. Yoga is sort of the personalized version of Samkhya cosmology. Concepts rest on the same terminology and have essentially the same meanings between yoga and Samkhya. Samkhya says these processes of creation begin when two qualities of energy come together, one that's represented as non-feminine and as feminine energy and non-material energy, and the other that's represented as material or masculine energy. And what's being represented is that the simple act of these two energies coming together with each other serves as a catalyst that sets off all of the other effects of creation. So to start with, I want to talk about how that is represented to be true. It boils down to a concept of spinning energy, not unlike what you have in the Perceptions Today logo. As a matter of fact, that logo, if we added one more symbol, gets to the very heart of some of this. Spinning energy is one of the starting points. Science refers to that as angular momentum. It's actually fostered by two qualities of energy that come together in a dynamic called angular impulse. If you have two temperatures, streams of water of different temperature or different speeds that come together, they tend to spin. The same thing is true with energy. As a matter of fact, water is one of the go-to metaphors that science uses and the ancient traditions use to try to represent how energy works. The Dogon actually say that water is the pattern for energy in the universe. So two qualities of energy come together and they spin. And as they spin, they create resonance and resistance. Resistance is mass. And the resistance builds to a point where it has to be relieved. You can think of that in terms of a snowplow pushing snow ahead of it. It reaches a point where the snow can no longer simply be pushed just forward. There's a perpendicular pushing of the snow off to the sides that happens at a certain point. Energy is the same way. It spins. When it creates enough resistance, the resistance has to be relieved, and vectors of energy are emitted that are perpendicular to the plane of the spinning energy. That's called angular inertia. For the Dogon, as energy spins into materiality, there are 7 vectors of energy that are emitted. And they're emitted, while they're emitted in a plane that's perpendicular to the spinning energy, each of those vectors has its own angularity across that plane. The one that is least resisted coming into materiality is the centermost one, the one that would correspond to the color green in a rainbow. Now, that dynamic I've described is the way that energy works at the interface between the energetic domain and the material domain. This is essentially quantum level effects. But we can carry those effects down further. We can reduce fractions even further. We can carry it down to what the Dogon describe as a root domain of energy. To be clear, what's going on in the broad perspective with energy is it begins in a state of superconductivity. That's a situation where electricity is unresisted and the flow of electricity is unresisted, but at a pace that is just below the threshold necessary to evoke magnetism. So magnetism is essentially dormant and electricity is unresisted. That state, left to its own natural devices, tries to migrate to a state of superinsulation where the reverse is true, where magnetic flux is unresisted and electrical flow is dormant. The entire continuum of energy in the universe that the Dogon described consists of that. It's the same dynamic of energy that causes a dipole to oscillate in and out and in and out. It extends out to the point where it reaches a state of superconductivity, and it then retracts back in until it reaches a state of superinsulation. Now, in that root domain, because you have a perpetual circuit of electricity flowing that needs no additional input to continue circulating, Einstein tells us that, okay, that's a state of zero resistance. And Einstein tells us that the more resistance we create, the more mass we create, the slower time runs. In the Dogon mentality, time is a natural oscillation that occurs between electricity and magnetism. And so in a state of superconductivity where there's no resistance, the pace of that oscillation is really, really, really rapid. Consequently, any disruption to that circuit, which can happen through an input of energy from the outside, or it can happen randomly, any interruption to that circuit creates a spark. And a spark is the equivalent of an electric monopole. It's the equivalent of an electron. And according to the Dogon, it naturally evokes two monopoles of magnetism, the equivalent of a north and a south pole of magnetism. And those three monopoles emerge as a unit. The input of energy also causes another effect. In a superconductive state, magnetism is perfectly aligned. That means that the dormant magnetism that defines the field that we're talking about, all of the north and south poles are aligned with each other throughout that domain. And one effect of that is, that's called parallel magnetism. And parallel magnetism tends to pull together, which is why we have the equivalent of what the ancients refer to as unity in that domain, because the magnetism is all pulling in one direction together inwardly. A second effect of the spark that happens is that it causes the magnetism, the two magnetic poles, to flip. And when they do that, they carry the electrical spark with it. That unit now sits anti-parallel to the magnetism in the rest of the domain. And so the effect is, since anti-parallel magnetism pushes, the three monopoles are ejected from the energetic domain, and they begin to self-differentiate a second domain that we call the material domain. So the entire dynamic is like a game of mahjong, if you're familiar with it, the tile game, where the game begins with all the tiles face down, and then throughout the course of playing the game, the tiles continue to be turned face up, face up, face up. That's the dynamic that's happening between non-materiality and materiality. And the more magnets you have turned up face up in the second domain, each magnet ends up creating a vortex. And ultimately, you create a situation where these vortices there are so many of them that they crowd each other out. They can no longer spin because they don't have room to spin. And at that point, the system settles back down into aligned magnetism, only this time aligned the opposite way from what it was originally. And so what you end up with is a superinsulating domain rather than a superconductive one. That's the whole shooting match in terms of what's happening on the two bookends, between the two bookends of the energetic domain. Now, the Dogon say that within that continuum, there are resonance points. And each resonance point functions very much like the note on a musical scale, which is the resonant point of vibrations as you move along a musical scale. The effect of it is to create zones comparable to biological zones in the deep ocean. We know that if you go into the deepest parts of the ocean, that there are certain types of animal and plant life that love that prefer to live on the bottom and dwell on the bottom of the ocean. And there are other forms all the way up the scale through the ocean. You pass through these naturally evoked zones where, depending on how much water pressure you have, how much sunlight the life form prefers, what temperature the life form prefers, and so on, you end up self-differentiating these zones, sometimes with creatures in the zone that are not capable of leaving the zone. Other times with creatures like a whale that's perfectly capable of crossing all the zones. So the Dogon are saying that what's fostered are 14 superposed domains of energy. I'll try to explain what they mean by that. They mean that these are not sequentially evoked any more than the domains of the deep ocean emerge sequentially. The domains in the ocean all exist simultaneously with one another. It's just that depending which zone you're in, you might not be aware that the other zones are there. There may not be a direct influence that you recognize. But the Dogon are saying that there is direct interaction among these zones. The zones are differentiated by differences in time frame. And the reason for that is because the process evokes greater and greater amounts of resistance, which is greater and greater amounts of mass, which, according to Einstein, implies a slower and slower pace of time. Now, we can illustrate that for ourselves intuitively by simply looking at how science represents the electromagnetic scale. What they say is that in the era that they perceive of as the Big Bang, that's associated with gamma rays, which are very short wavelength waves, very high frequency waves. But for scientists today to study those waves, they understand that they have mutated into microwaves, which are much, much longer wavelength waves. That effect across the continuum of the light spectrum reflects a progressive slowing of time frame. It illustrates a progressive slowing of time frame. Now, there's a second way that we can intuitively demonstrate for ourselves that the Dogon perspective is probably a correct one. And that's because that's through astronomers today use their telescopes to look further and further out into the universe, the expanding universe. And one of the confusions for them is that the further out they look, the quicker the rate of expansion is. And so they're imagining that there must be some unknown form of energy that's actively accelerating the expansion of the universe as we move out. The Dogons say, no, that's not the case. What's happening is we're just seeing the effect of our own progressively slowing time frame. So the further out we go, we're looking at a domain where time ran quicker than it did for us now. The effect is like for a passenger on a train who is not immediately certain whether his train changed speeds or the train on the next track changed speeds. It's not immediately obvious. It's the same kind of illusion as for centuries us believing that because of the way that the dynamic looked, that the sun was orbiting us, that we weren't orbiting the sun. So the Dogon differentiate these domains of time by factors of 10. They count R10, this is a combined Dogon and Egyptian perspective, that we count our domain as 1, and each descending domain that preceded us by the next factor of 10 quicker than us. And so you get down to the superconductive domain, and time is running 1 million times more quickly for us for the superconductive domain than it is for us. Anything we know that imagine looking at a video of traffic on a highway at night with the headlights on the cars. Now, if you run the video at normal speed, you see individual cars with individual headlights. But the more you quicken the pace of the playback of the video, the more the cars start to look like beams of light that are tracing across the highway, not individual cars. There's exactly that same effect with this progressive slowing of time through this continuum. So we're far enough distant from the superconductive domain that even if circumstances in that domain were exactly the same as they are for us, from the perspective of someone in that domain, time runs so much more quickly that it's going to look like energy to us regardless. Now, okay, so that's the perspective from the point of view of matter, of how the domains emerge, how the original monopoles of energy emerge. Now, those monopoles, a single electrical monopole and the pair of magnetic monopoles are the equivalent of a proton and an electron. In other words, we can think of the superconductive domain as being a gigantic reservoir of potential electrons and protons. So when scientists look at a hydrogen atom, which is comprised of just an electron and a proton, they understand that the electron and the proton are quantumly entangled with each other, that if you flip the spin attribute of one, you also flip the spin attribute of the other. It's as if they're connected, but they don't have a framework for understanding how they became connected. Well, from the Dogon perspective, they emerged connected. That in fact, we can say that there's a dimensional relationship between the electron and the electric monopole and the magnetic monopoles. We know that for two reasons. First, because these energies express themselves perpendicularly to one another, which is a signature of dimensionality. The second thing is that the monopole of electricity compares to a geometric point, whereas the two monopoles of magnetism compare to the two geometric points that define a geometric line. So we have a dimensional aspect just in terms of the structure. Scientists has yet to detect a monopole of magnetism by itself. Theoretically, they exist, but so far in real world context, we haven't detected that. So from my perspective, from the very outset, we have a dimensional difference between magnetism and electricity, which means that there's a potential space for an oscillation to happen. We can't have an oscillation between two things without the equivalent of a space. There has to be room to oscillate. So Egyptian words and Egyptian symbols, which I have the benefit of the fact that the Egyptian hieroglyphs define the meanings of the words that they're used to spell, that each glyph represents a concept, and there are certain Egyptian words that assign concepts to glyphs. And if you know what those concepts are, then anytime you see an ancient Egyptian word, you can play a rebus game and you can substitute a concept for each of the glyphs, and you produce a sentence that tells you what the scribe meant to say with the word and the nuances of meaning he was trying to convey, he or she. So the Egyptian words explain to us that these dynamics of energy are associated with the concept of magnification. If you imagine that there is a lensing effect going on as time slows, then under the covers, so to speak, whatever that space is between the two monopoles of magnetism and the one monopole of electricity, that little space gets magnified. And when it gets magnified from our point of view, it might well be that space hasn't really expanded at all, that the reason those particles are still entangled, even though the electron seems to be widely distantly separated from the proton, is because in reality, with the unmagnified view, there's still a cluster. And so you flip one and you're automatically flipping the other. So it turns out there's what's called a resonant state one of the resonant states of a hydrogen atom, coincides with that concept of the three monopoles. As a matter of fact, it's diagrammed as essentially as three monopoles coming together.
I was just going to quickly ask you about that. With the resonance, do you reckon it's a high resonance or a very low resonance or something in between, or a different way that am I expressing it? Because it could be
the monopoles are the initial resonant state of a hydrogen atom. So when I say initial, I mean quickest pace of time.
Okay.
Least magnification of view of space. Now, before we move further than that, I'll try to explain another way of understanding how space expands. Imagine you could stand outside of the whole system of time and space and with an objective view of what was happening, and that you could measure in the quickest domain of energy, you could measure an objective length for a moment. And in that moment, light would extend a certain distance because light moves at a constant speed. You could measure the distance that light moved in that moment. Now imagine that while you were sleeping, someone came in and doubled that objective duration of a moment. To someone who's in the system, because all of the factors in their life would double at the same time. Okay, in that doubled duration of a moment, light would now be able to extend twice as far as it had before. So it would look to someone in the system as if distance had extended when it actually hadn't. All that actually happened was a moment took twice as long as it did before. But the perspective for the person in it is space had just doubled. And it took them twice as long to get to the edge of it as it did before. So it's this doubling and redoubling of the pace of time that's causing certain effects to happen. Now we can demonstrate that mass must be instrumental in that process. The formation of mass must be instrumental in that process because scientists have said that the period of time in which it took the universe to double in volume is the same amount of time it took the ratio of mass to energy to double. So we have a 1-to-1 correspondence between this transference from energy to mass and what appears to us as the expansion of space. So we get down to the hydrogen atom again, and we know that the monopoles represent, the three monopoles represent the root resonant state of a hydrogen atom. Now, if we input energy to the atom, we're doing a couple of things. First of all, we're flipping the spin attributes of the proton and the electron, just like we did back in the superconductive state. The input of energy is causing the electron to shift outward by not incremental amounts, but by a fixed amount. And the reason it's a fixed amount is because that process only works if an adequate amount of energy has been input, equivalent to push that electron or the atom itself to the next resonant state of the atom. And so the shells of the atom that these electrons are moving outward into correspond to the resonant states of the hydrogen atom. We know this is true because in 1920, Louise de Broglie, a French aristocrat and physicist, wrote a seminal paper on the resonant states of a hydrogen atom that ended up forming the foundation of Heisenberg's quantum theories. But de Broglie's paper somehow got ignored by the scientific world to the extent that it was never even translated into English. Few, if any, references to it in any scientific book, text. in 2018 or 19, a French physicist named Andre, Andre Borman, wrote a paper on the resonance states of a hydrogen atom and resurrected this paper by de Broglie and actually translated it for the first time into English. Part of what de Broglie did in his paper is he measured and diagrammed an aspect of the hydrogen atom that is not obvious. It's a very subtle aspect that you don't even know it's there unless you do the work that he did. What he was tracking and measuring was the cyclical presence of magnetism for an electron orbiting the atom. That's the first thing he measured. It takes the same shape as the glyph that makes your Perceptions Today logo. That's the same shape that defines the continuum of energy in the universe for the Dogon and Egyptians. It's the Egyptian glyph shape. It starts and ends at what looks to us like a singularity, and it expands in the middle and then contracts again in two stages, two halves of a cycle. The second thing that de Broglie measured was the cyclical presence of magnetism for components of the proton. And that diagram is a match for the Egyptian single wave glyph shape. It's just a simple up down. It's like the oscillation of any frequency of energy. Now, those concepts in Egyptian hieroglyphic language define the ancient concept of the hidden aspect of deity. When Egypt or Judaism or any other ancient culture talks about a hidden god, the Dogon talk about their deity Amma being a hidden god. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about these effects of energy, these resonant effects of energy on the electron and the proton that are not evident outwardly. You can't get at them directly. So the first implication of this is, okay, I'll take you to a second name, a second ancient Egyptian word. Okay, once I knew what those two glyphs were, it occurred to me that it's not possible that the ancient Egyptians didn't reference those, the same way that the Dogon and other comparative traditions end up making reference to them. There had to be Egyptian words that would provide me with more information about those two glyphs. So I started searching out glyphs written with just those two glyphs. One of those words, Sir E.A. Wallace Budge defines as the divine name. This is the equivalent of the ancient name for God that was lost over time. It comes down to these two resonant effects.
Sorry to pause you there. I was just going to ask you, I got the divine name, but I didn't catch how you were going to pronounce the guy's name again.
The researcher was de Broglie.
I got de Broglie, got that one. Okay. It's the last one, was the divine name, begin with C.
The pronunciation of the divine name, okay. Budge pronounces it Ren. Now we understand.
Sorry, you said there was a guy's name beginning with C, I think, and then you said they were doing the divination of the divine name. So it was just before that. Okay,
that's Sir E.A. Wallace Budge. He's the 1920s era compiler of an Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary that has, in the present day, gone out of favor with traditional Egyptologists. But it's in predictive agreement with the Dogon language. So from my perspective, Budge can't be flatly wrong about the Egyptian language and in predictive agreement with the Dogon at the same time. So I work from Budge's dictionary. Many of the key references that I need to link to the Dogon have been sort of filtered out of the modern dictionaries that are being used. Back in the 1980s, I know one of the Egyptologists who was involved in the reformulation of the dictionary. And I have differences of opinion about a number of the things they did. I'll give you an example of some of the choices, one of the choices that was made. In every ancient society that had connection with Egypt, contemporaneously or after, the name of the hidden god Amen is pronounced Amen, except Ethiopia, where it's pronounced Emen. These Egyptologists, in their infinite wisdom, decided the correct pronunciation was Emen. When they do that, they effectively disconnect this concept I'm talking about from all of those other traditions. So now, another Egyptian word that's formulated based on the same two glyphs, only it also carries a trailing glyph that's unpronounced. That's the form of one way of defining a meaning of a glyph or emphasizing the meaning of a word. The trailing glyph is the image of a mother goddess on her knees. Actually, it might be just a woman. It might not be a mother goddess on her knees, lifting up a newborn infant, and they both perceive each other. Symbolically, what the word says is perceives the mother. I take it as a congratulatory statement because no one would deliberately seek this word out. The only person who would deliberately seek this word out based on the glyphs already understands what those glyphs represent. This is the connection back to the non-material feminine in its root form. This is how superconductive energy connects forward to an atom. Now, Budge pronounces the word of the divine name as Ren, R-E-N or R-E-N-N. But we know that the Egyptian hieroglyphic language, like the Hebrew language, vowel sounds were not written. So an audience who knew how to speak the language already knew what vowel sound to fill in. I can write a sentence in English with no vowel sounds and you can probably read it. However, it means that translators are forced to guess what the vowel sound was. So working instead from a set of syllables that are proper representations of concepts in the ancient symbolic tradition I'm working with, I know that the proper syllables to represent this aspect of energy is Re, Na. Re is a term that refers to energy, and Na is a term that defines the non-material feminine. In later cultures, it's also a term that means queen. So those two symbols, which correspond to the resonant states of electron and a proton in a hydrogen atom, are absolutely central to ancient concepts of what we see as deity. From Buddhist perspective, certain of these traditions don't actually deify anything, including the main ones I work with. Samkhya is expressly non-theistic. The Dogon tradition, while their myths are presented as if they deify Amma, we can tell by the way the four words are formulated that this is a scientific representation, not a mythical one. That Amma symbolism pertains to the initiating stages of these creational themes. So there's not a requirement that we deify this, even though in certain traditions they do. The center point of spinning energy, which is the proton, is the seat of deity in Buddhism and for the Dogon. That's the domain in which the concept of deity sits. According to Adrian Snodgrass, who is a leading authority on Buddhist architecture and symbolism, that center point of energy is also the seat of deity, that the term deity is founded on a word datu, which means it compares to the modern word data, but he understands it to refer to the aspect of this continuum that doesn't change, isn't subject to change. All other aspects of it transition. They go through phase transition, they go through expansion, apparent expansion, they go through changes in level of energy, but that center point of the spinning energy doesn't. It holds firm. It's in a single form that never changes.
Just a quick one for you. Myron's got a question on that.
Okay.
I have a few questions. I have
You'll need to lean closer.
First of all, I know that the Dogon were involved with Sirius B, and they seem to know a lot about it long before anybody else knew anything about it. Plus, they seem to know about Saturn and the the moons around Saturn, and they knew the exact amount. And I know that I've read some things that people were very confused on how they could possibly know that. And I thought that was really interesting in their cosmology, that is kind of different, say, than being born from the earth, man born from the earth, like in the Jewish tradition, rather than being born from water. And that water is so significant. And so those were important points. And then most of all, I'm a sculptor, so I wanted you to talk a little bit about the masks. Their masks are spectacular, and when I saw them, I just couldn't quite get over the power in those wooden masks, and they're wooden for a reason, as I understand their cosmology, or whatever, spirituality. And so those are some of the questions that I had about the Dogon. That is sort of incredible to me, that they would know about Sirius B that nobody else knew about, Saturn and four moons, and that their cosmology is really based more in the real essence of life, which is water, not in the earth being born out of dirt, like in other cosmologies. So if you could talk about some of the mythologies of that, I'd be interested.
Okay, first I'll start with the statement that the Dogon knew about Sirius, but nobody else did. From my perspective, that's not true. This, how can I explain this? Okay, first off, the reason that Sirius is significant in the Dogon tradition, okay, the Dogon and the Buddhists understand their traditions as an intentionally instructed tradition in ancient times, instructed by a group that already had mastered all this science. This is not being presented as theory. This is being presented as here's how it works. And their perspective is that instruction was conducted globally in ancient times. So cultures on every continent benefited from it. Now, we can demonstrate that's true because part of the system is part of what it's trying to do is, because there's parallelism in these concepts, it's helpful to point us to structures that we can actually look at to understand structures we can't look at. So the first one, it's different. From my perspective, the one that is most immediately significant is a structure called Barnard's Loop. It's a spiraling birthplace of stars that centers on the belt stars of Orion, but we can't see it because its light is so faint. You can only image it with time-lapse photography. The Dogon referred to it as the chariot of Orion because when you image it, it looks like a spiral it's the wheel of the chariot that Orion the Hunter is standing in.
Well, it seems to me that their understanding evolved like most cosmologies, that it started in one place and moved as they got more information or something like
No.
that.
No, the Dogon societal imperative is to preserve original forms. And the way we can demonstrate that they've done that is through comparative study to other traditions that have done the same thing. I have closely matching systems, one given in Sanskrit with Buddhism, and the other given in the Dogon language, which is often Egyptian hieroglyphic words, with the Dogon in Africa. Now, because they're given in entirely different languages, it's not reasonable that one simply adopted the system wholesale from the other. Also, both systems have legitimate claim to being ancient. The Buddhist system was documented by around 400 BC.
Right.
The Dogon system is given in words that went out of use around 700 BC. So we have two matching systems that are both claiming the same set of things in the same way and that corroborate each other. A modern authority on Buddhism is in substantial agreement with a modern authority on the Dogon cosmology. And that's the demonstration that nothing substantial changed all the way down the millennia. If it had, they wouldn't be in agreement with each other anymore.
Now,
So,
I also read that there was a synergy between the gods, or God, and their plant, animal, etc. Lifestyle. That this synergy worked as a union, that they weren't really separate. They were sort of combined in some sort of, and during the dances with the wooden masks, that some of those masks represented that marriage. Now that's my word,
yes,
not their
and
word.
I'll get to that in a second here.
Okay.
Okay, so we have cultures all over the world, according to Jung, who perceive either a wheel or a chariot associated with Orion.
Right.
Now that demonstrates that all those cultures at one point in time were influenced by the same system, because there's no objective reason to do that. You and I look at Orion, there's no objective reason to imagine a wheel or a chariot there.
Right.
Okay, so it's not that the Dogon had knowledge nobody else had, it's that they did a better job of keeping it in correct form.
Oh, okay. I'll buy that.
Okay. Okay, now we were talking earlier about the dimensional relationship between magnetism and electricity. Let's step back and talk about dimensionality a little bit. Einstein says he defines time as the fourth dimension, but we know that nothing reasonably can transpire except in the context of time. So we really have to treat time as the first dimension, not the last. But what Einstein leaves us with is 3 linear dimensions and 1 energetic one, which is time. So Einstein has sort of tipped the hand of the existence of a concept of energetic dimensionality. And these 2 energies that I was talking about sort of extend that. We can see that dimensionality, there are 3 energetic dimensions, at least, and there are 3 linear dimensions, at least, and we can imagine those on the material and the non-material halves of the scale of energy. One of those Dogon masks takes the shape of sort of, if you put 2 E's back to back together along their back edge,
Right.
with the prong sticking out on either side. It's called the kanaga.
Right.
Now we have the fortunate situation with the Dogon language that Dogon words also tell us what they mean. The language has defined a set of root syllables that relate to concepts, and those syllables are combined together with each other to form more complicated concepts. So kanaga implies, through its phonetics, ka is the concept of an embrace, na is the concept of the non-material feminine, and ga is their term for temporality. They talk about past, present, and as if in a dream. That kanaga figure is a correlate to the symbol of the Vajra in Hinduism, which represents the same thing. These are both trying to represent the idea that three descending states of dimensionality on the energetic side come together with three ascending states of dimensionality on the descending side.
All right.
Okay, so that mask is very important because the celebration of the Sigi festival, which is the primary celebration of the Dogon culture, where those masks are brought out, they're worn as headdresses.
Yeah, they're really amazing.
Is a celebration of that cosmology and the celebration of the Sirius stars. Okay, now let's get back to the Sirius stars for a moment. The Dogon perspective is that we have parallelism on all scales. This is as above, so below material.
Right.
Okay. Scientifically speaking, and the Dogon also say that our sun emerged from Barnard's Loop in the company of the two Sirius stars. The same way the three monopoles emerged from superconductivity together. They also say that our sun then was pushed outward from the other two stars, and they diagram how it was pushed outward. And the diagram they give is a match for the scientific understanding of how magnetism influences electricity to extent. So from the Dogon perspective, our sun is an electron, the counterpart to an electron, and the two Sirius stars are counterparts to the north and south poles of a magnet or a proton. So it makes perfect sense that the dynamics of energy that we experience, seeing as how we're circulating around an electron, would be the same as the cyclical presence of magnetism for an electron in an atom. So it's not a mystery that the continuum of energy that the Dogon draw and define is a match for that those resonant states in science and in an atom and for the Dogon. It's all the same stuff. And it makes sense because we're dealing with parallel components of the same system.
Okay.
Okay, now, so anytime there's a reference to an astronomical body in this system, it's trying to illustrate for us one of these dynamics of energy that are essential for understanding how the system works. And the reason they do that is because, as I said, it doesn't matter what level we view them on. If we can understand how the Sirius stars work, we now suddenly understand how a hydrogen atom emerges.
Okay.
Okay, now, there are advantages to looking at things at both scales. The advantage of examining the dynamics of energy on the scale of superconductivity is that the dynamics are so very simple and there's so few of them that there's not a lot of complication what our perspective of it has to be. That we can see at a superconductive domain that the effect that pushed the monopoles out of the superconductive domain is the same effect that pushed the Earth away from the Sirius stars coming out of Barnard's Loop. This effect is gravity, but if we accept that that's gravity, that's the first expression of gravity, then we also have to accept that gravity is not a pull, it's a push. That gravity is to differences in domain of, or differences in pace of time, what buoyancy is to differences in pressure of water. That a buoyant object floats to the domain of least pressure the same way that a massed object floats to the domain of slowest time frame. This is a buoyancy effect. It's not, there's no gravity particle, there's no exotic force of gravity that we don't understand. This is simple buoyancy. We have differences, progressive differences in the pace that time runs at, and so things that experience the same time frame gravitate together. Now, this brings us to a very important issue that connects to the biology that I'm writing about presently. One of the great mysteries for the biologists is two things. First, the reactions that occur inside a cell transpire at all sorts of different paces, all sorts of different rates. The initial molecular interactions that happen are happening at a pace that corresponds to what the Dogon say occurs in the superconductive or one of the root domains of energy. There are two root domains. But that produces a byproduct that now has a different vibrational frequency and is now able to interact with other elements. In biology, only elements that vibrate at the same frequency can interact. So one of the mysteries is, how is it that these elements find each other? How in the context of the relatively huge context of a whole cell, do just the right component elements find each other to interact? And they're trying to postulate transmission methods by which the elements somehow come together. They're thinking that there's an electrical signal that attracts them to each other or whatever. My perspective is much simpler than that. Change the vibrational level of the component and you changed how gravity affects it. You've essentially put it into a different domain than that deep sea water. And so gravity naturally pulls them together. That there's no question about why the life forms on the seafloor find each other to interact with. Those are the ones that are there to interact with. They don't have an opportunity to interact with the ones that are at the surface of the water.
You know, I was reading about their ceremonies and dances, and it seemed to me that like the Aborigines in Australia, I'm not comparing the two cultures, don't get me wrong, just this idea, just the idea of the dance, that when the Dogon are doing, when certain parts of the Dogon dance characters, because there's more than one character, and they represent different things, right?
Right.
So every time one of those characters touches the earth, they're making a connection with all things. And then another one is connecting to all water. Another one is connecting to all space-time. Another one is all connecting to life and death. And so the monumental impression I got from their dances with those masks, I mean, I'm telling you, I was blown away. I was just blown away. And the fact that it's kind of like bringing heaven to earth, you know, when you're stomping on the ground, like they do in Australia,
right?
You're really bringing heaven to earth and making a synergy of that union. And that is really, really powerful in the Dogon masked dances, in my opinion.
I agree completely. And that's that same synergy. It's non-material energy coming together with material energy. You know, it's mass is equated with the concept of earth.
Right.
The Hopi Indians also do very similar dances, sometimes the same dance using the same symbology. Now, rewind 11,000 years. Imagine yourself the other person formulating this symbolic system, and you understand it's scientific. So only a scientific culture is ever going to get the references, which means the cultures you're dealing with right on the scene, you need to, if you're targeting your message to a technologically capable culture in the future, you've got to frame your messages in a way that will hold together for the non-technical cultures, but that will hold together well enough that the technical cultures will recognize what you were talking about.
Sure.
So part of the problem is that the teachers are very capable teachers. They want to use sophisticated techniques like metaphors, but a metaphor only works if I understand the metaphor you're using. If you make a reference to an opera I've never seen, the reference is lost on me.
Right.
Okay, so they're in the position of having to guess 11,000 years ahead of time which metaphors are going to resonate and which ones aren't. And so to hedge their bets, what they do is they express the same ideas again and again in multiple metaphors. So one of those metaphors is to express it in a myth form, tell a story. Another of those metaphors is tell it in dance form, We're going to express the same ideas in dance form. Say it in symbols, say it in rituals.
Right, right. Like most cultures.
Right. So there's another level to that. Express it in terms of what happens in the animal kingdom, then express it in terms of, let's see, what happens with states of energy we see, the water, fire, wind, earth references.
Yeah, I mean, they become the animal, they become the plant,
Right.
and they dance to those energies.
And they stated in terms of the animal kingdom, starting with insects and working up to birds. It's sort of moving upward from the face of the earth.
Right.
They tried everything they could think of to guarantee that the message was going to get across to somebody like us.
Why would they care?
Because, okay, this is an essential question. There's an entire book that lays the foundation for what I'm about to tell you. It's called Seeking the Primordial. But the outlook is this. The general outlook is this. That Samkhya says that the fully ascending, okay, we're talking about two domains, one that's energetic, one that's more energetic, one that's more material. The more energetic one is becoming increasingly more energetic. The material one is becoming increasingly more material. It's like sand shifting in an hourglass. The energetic material is headed to a point where it has perfect knowledge, but no ability to take action. The material side is headed to a point where it has imperfect knowledge, but full ability to take action.
Right.
The problem is, okay, there's a state for humanity, for a human being that compares to that non-materiality state of being fully conscious, but not able to take action. It's called locked-in syndrome. And unless you have a compatriot who knows you're there and can take action on your behalf, it's as horrific as being buried alive, because that's all it is. You're being buried alive.
Yeah.
So we have a cycle of energy where the two universes take turns being in that role. And about a third of the way into the cycle, they see where it's headed. They understand that the only compatriot they have who is going to know that they're there and can take action on their behalf and to communicate with them when they're locked in is the material side. But at the point where they're most locked in, we're going to be most distanced from even knowing they're there. So they choose to take action. They establish a framework for society, for humanity, that has the hope, they hope, of preserving the knowledge in some of us that the non-material consciousness is there, and, to try to promote facilities for communicating with it.
Okay.
That's the motivation.
Okay, that makes sense. Because I also read that their ideas have permeated Iran and a lot of areas around Africa. And I mean, thousands of years ago, not today. I mean, and that's incredible to me. I know that it's an interesting concept that they cared enough to want to share their insight with the world at all, because a lot of that stuff is esoteric and they don't want to share it, and they want to keep it sort of a secret. I'm not talking about the Dogon, I'm talking about other cultures. And
Well, that also depends on the era. In the era of ancient Crete, all of this information was freely shared publicly.
by them.
No, by the initiates.
Oh, okay.
Same thing on Orkney, that the information was right out in the open. There was not an attempt to hide it.
Oh,
So it depends on which era and which culture you're talking about, whether there's an effort to keep it secret. The esoteric tradition itself for the Dogon is formulated in a way, if you're the informant and I'm the initiate, it's my job to ask you the next pertinent question. And if I do that, you are required to give me a truthful answer back.
okay.
that dynamic is training the initiate to communicate non-materially, because that's the dynamic between us and non-material consciousness. Is in various ways we pose a question, and if it's the proper question, we get an answer back.
Okay, but like in the Aborigine in Australia, they keep things pretty close to the vest. If you want to try to permeate and penetrate their mythologies, you can do it, but they keep things back, as I understand it. I have some art at the University of Melbourne that's on display there, and I was there and I was talking to some anthropologists at the university, and they were talking about that there is a lot of resistance from elders in that culture, that they don't want to let a lot of information out. They keep it very close to the breast.
Well, that's true for the Dogon also. There are actually penalties levied against anybody who says something publicly they shouldn't.
Whoa, really?
Yeah.
That's interesting. That is interesting, because then that is a kind of parallel between that angel.
Well, what they're doing is, this is a filtering process. They are vetting caretakers for the non-material intelligence. It's a 20-year process. And so what they want is the person who has a sincere desire to pursue this, has the capabilities to understand what they're pursuing and to communicate in the mode that esotericism requires. And it's a filtering process. It's an audition process. And so the person who's sincere and who's the guy you want to get through the process is the one who keeps at it for 20 years.
I got you. Right. I think that answers most of the questions that I had. I must tell you, though, that the mask thing just blew me away. I'm a sculptor, and I just thought they were magnificent.
Yep. And each mask has its own meanings and its own symbolism of when it's worn and what it's worn for. Same with the dances, have their own symbolism.
They had a goddess of water that was like hands up like this, and she was so beautiful. My God, it's just such a beautiful hand carved. It's about, it's probably 10, 12 feet high. And wow, it was just amazing.
Okay.
Out of water.
Yeah, getting back to water, the Dogons say that water is the pattern for this energy.
Right.
Now, I have said that we have the equivalent of dimensionality, only that's energetic in an energetic form, not a material form. We also have the equivalent of molecules in an energetic form. That those three monopoles that come out of the superconductive domain that form the resonant state of a hydrogen atom, the dynamics among those monopoles is essentially the dynamics among the atoms of a water molecule. And so as you move upward into water molecules, you have all the same oscillations of energy. You have the same differentiation of domains that happens between the non-material and material domains. That occurs the same way. You have, next to every membrane in a living being's body, you have a superconductive zone created that is a natural exclusion zone. It's anti-parallel magnetism forces everything out of that zone, and the water molecules that are in it are condensed and aligned magnetically, and now you have a mode of communication in the body that's secondary. I mean, it's actually primary to the nervous system. Signals through that set of conduits reach the brain half a second quicker than they do through the nervous system. Mei Wan Ho, who is one of the, she passed away recently, but she's one of the researchers who hit all of this on the head, who researched it from a biological standpoint and came up with answers that just fit like a glove with the Dogon perspectives, says that every living organism is a quantum coherent organism, just as the domain of energy I was talking about, the continuum of energy I was talking about in the universe, is a quantum coherent continuum. What I mean by that is, imagine a jazz combo that every player in the jazz combo has maximum freedom to improvise however they want to,
Right.
but all in harmony with a shared theme.
And
That's
structure.
how Meiwan Ho sees a living organism. Energy in a living organism is quantum coherent. Energy in the universe is quantum coherent. So that yes, there's free will in the same way that a jazz musician has free will, but there's also adherence to a broad harmony.
Yeah, there's a structure underneath the music that's there. They can't really get away from it.
Now, to give you a sense of the character of the what can I say, call this, the primordial intelligence or consciousness that's behind all of this, those monopoles are treated as messengers into the material world. And the Dogon have a name for them. They're called Tityeni. Another name is Numo. They relate to the.
I couldn't pronounce it if I tried, so I just gave up.
Now,
I was just going to say that obviously Aaron Voot's watching from YouTube and he's being blown away because obviously his research is very well connected with the information that you've been providing with many of your books. I've also just picked out, hopefully, the right person. You said she was a geneticist, yes?
Yes, Meiwan Ho. That's the right person. She has 2 books. One is called that have bearing on this. One is called The Rainbow and the Worm.
Right. I'll go and grab that as well in a minute. And
the second is called Living Rainbow H2O.
Right. I'll go and grab those and I'll bring them back for the chat box. And
now there's a colleague of hers who is a bioengineer at University of Washington. I've actually exchanged a series of emails with him. His name is Gerald Pollack. He's also written 2 books. One is called Cells, Gels, and Engines of Life. And the other is called The Fourth State of Water. Now, in discussions with Pollack, he has perspectives from a biologist's point of view of how these exclusion zones next to the membranes occur. 70% or more of the water in any living organism is within microns of a membrane, which means they're within microns of this domain that collects and communicates globally. I wanted to finish up the previous thing I was saying, that the Tityeni is the name for those 3 monopoles that are sent as messengers and that carry information back from the material side. In that interpretation of the meaning of messenger is a sort of a colloquial interpretation. Literally, what the Dogon word means is to send to say hello.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I remember reading that.
Okay. That's just one of any number of really superbly friendly characterizations of this non-material consciousness. That the few times you get a direct glimpse on what that consciousness is, it's always just that very sweet, friendly, outreaching consciousness. It's the same idea as the newborn infant being lifted by its mother and they each perceive each other for the first time. That's the sweetness of the interaction that's characterized between the non-material consciousness and us.
It's just wonderful stuff. Are there any volcanoes anywhere near where the Dogon were founded?
I don't know that the Dogon are situated anywhere near volcanoes. I haven't read that there's any volcanic effects that have to do with them, but
it was only brought it up because the production of water on Earth can come from volcanoes as much as it comes from supposedly asteroids. In fact, the theory is that it's just as many come from volcanoes, just as much water came from volcanoes as come from asteroids. I think that's the
now
final...
talking about those membranes in the biological organism. One of the pervasive creational themes of the ancient cosmologies is focused on the idea of a sleeping goddess she's sleeping at the surface of the water,
Right.
and the first glow of light induces her to open her eyes and perceive it, and that catalyzes material creation.
Let there be light.
That's
Right.
precisely what's going on with energy at these aqueous membrane interfaces within a body.
That's wonderful stuff. Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. Your questions are always right on point also. So,
I just love that stuff. I just love it. I just tell you that right now. By the way, when I was looking all this up, your books are referred to on YouTube. I mean, on looking through the computer, it says book by Lord. It gives your name. So
that's great.
I just laughed when I saw that. I thought, God, he's going to be on a podcast.
Yeah,
Pretty well
somebody
known.
told me last week that they found my book, one of my books, in a bookstore in Luxor, Egypt, and I thought, okay.
It happens.
Now I was going to say I was in contact with Gerald. Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say before you go any further, Eileen's got a question, possibly.
Okay.
Thank you. Where do I begin?
Yes.
I come from a very different perspective on this. And while I am able to listen to the science, and just kind of absorb and sit in it, it is not my language.
Mm-hmm.
Energy is my language. So
Okay.
I'm coming from the experiential. I'm coming from, I know precisely what you mean by that. First of all, the magnetic energy that precedes contact for me. And the changes that I've experienced as a result of this contact, this energetic contact, initiated Kundalini in my body, and that occurred in 1998, which opened my awareness to what I feel is the more of the unmanifest, or the primordial, if you will, and getting to know that language.
Right.
And translating that language, dialoguing with this other presence that does not, I've never found any category for it in what exists in the world. That's why I'm starting to listen to more, learn more about quantum entanglement and, just quantum mechanics in general. Because I cannot find the answer here to what is experiential.
Right.
There is no new age, there's no religion that fully explains this to me. So I'm constantly seeking explanations or listening to people who have been studying the mechanics of this, so that I can find the right words to describe what is experiential. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yep.
Oh, thank God. So what you're describing about energy, I'm more interested or I should say it this way, I'm absolutely fascinated by how this affects our own bioenergetics.
Okay.
What does this feel like? What does it look like? How do we, I know what you're talking about when you speak of coherence. This has been taught to me by this intelligence about how to come into coherence with these energetics. So I hope that I can sound somewhat intelligent in what I'm presenting, and I'm not even sure if I can ask a question. I guess I'm asking you to speak more about what this is like for the human have the Dogon spoken about how the human being and the biology relates to this and comes into coherence with it?
Okay, Hinduism probably offers the clearest perspectives. Renee Guénon wrote about states of consciousness and levels of consciousness, and how individualized consciousness connects back to all preceding higher levels of consciousness, all the way back to the root consciousness. The work I'm writing about right now provides a perspective that has scientific reasonableness to it for how that connection back could be a legitimate thing. Quantum coherence gives us, it's a recognized scientific concept that gives us the mechanism by which it happens. And I have two leading biologists who explain the mechanisms by how it happens biologically. Now, there's a third aspect to this, which is the consciousness itself, which I'm working my way towards. I do my work sort of in increments, in steps. Coming 4 weeks ago, I had no idea what the next book was going to be that I was going to write about. I was pursuing several different ideas. I was doing a lot of reading and research I was reading Mei-Wan Ho's books. I was reading a number of different things. But suddenly the right piece fell into place, and now I'm 2/3 of the way through the next manuscript. So that's how things are going to happen for me when it comes to the consciousness side of things. Right now, I don't have clear insights. I have the Dogon statement that these same energetics underlie the consciousness. And because they've been right about everything else, I have every reason to think they're right about this. But I don't have the precise linkage yet to be able to say, okay, here's how it works. And that's what I want to try to get to. And I'm hoping finishing the book on the biology will lead me to the entry points to the consciousness side.
Very, very exciting, Laird.
It's really interesting stuff.
I'm happy to converse with you more on that. I believe that the missing piece so often in all of these research, projects and studies is the human experience of it.
Right.
Because some of us experiencers are quite invisible because we don't have the language or the framing in which to express what is happening to us and how we're changing, we're being changed. I do come in contact with a few other experiencers that speak this way about these bioenergetic changes that are occurring and the dialogue that is occurring with this intelligence. And I'm not talking about, different races of ETs or, planetary homes of other beings. I'm talking about recently I've been exploring in the book, it's the first book I've listened to or read in years, which is Origins of the Gods.
Right.
And so you're familiar with that book?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
And so I wanted to ask you about plasma and this fourth state of matter and how this relates or fits in to your work.
Okay, well, those exclusion zone domains I said exist inside of each membrane, is more of a lipid-like state than a water-like state. It's Gerald Pollack is defining it as a fourth state of matter, of water, that he compares to plasma. That in the past, the functioning of a cell was interpreted that there was mostly water inside of a cell that wasn't doing very much, and that the interactions were happening across the membrane of the cell, which they don't understand how the membrane works. But now the focus is on the plasma effects and the things that are occurring within that, because a lipid structure, sort of what's called a liquid crystal structure, has different attributes and different ways of responding than regular water does. In any everyday body of water, you have two states that oscillate with each other the same way the Dogon are saying our universes are oscillating with each other. That there's a constant shift from a coherent state where the molecules are aligned in more of this liquid crystal form. And when they say liquid crystal, what they mean is that the molecules arrange themselves the same way they would in a solid crystal, only it's a liquid. And by doing that, they create the ability to transmit without resistance through the equivalent of what's a superconductive setting. They eliminate the resistance for the electricity. Now, they also create a situation where one of the big questions for the biologists is how are the raw materials for the interactions of biology, how do they come about? Well, they say that any root interaction in biology begins with a spark, which is just what the Dogon say happens with the superconductive domain. After that, if you have a series of transactions, they're shifting across these domains of time. Two items interact and create a third item that is now at a slower vibrational rate, so it corresponds to the next stage of the continuum. And it interacts with other things in that domain that then shift into the next domain. So it begins with a spark, but then the chemical reactions can continue that reaction across the domain. The interesting thing is that biologically, all of the domains are participating in what makes us live. So because there's parallelism in the energy, that implies that all of the domains of energy that we can trace from the Big Bang to now are also actively participating in what we experience. It's not sequential. I mean, it's not simply sequential. This is the concept of quantum coherence. You have individualized things happening in the context of global things. But plasma is a big part of that, and it's that state of water that all of these biological effects makes possible. Talking with Pollock, he had developed chemical theories as to how it is that these exclusion zones develop themselves inside the memories, because they don't really have a clue what could cause it. The same thing happens at the membrane of a cell. They've got a big problem because at first they thought the membranes were impermeable, that nothing could pass across the membrane of a cell. Then they discovered that sodium atoms could. So they asked themselves, well, sodium atoms can, but other things can't. So the size of the opening in the membrane must be just big enough for the sodium atom to get through, but nothing else. But then they started noticing a whole range of other components that can move one way or another across that membrane, but of all various sizes. So they don't have a conception of what kind of a structure could be limiting passage through the membrane. And I tried to explain to Pollock that that's the wrong approach. The right approach, based on the energetics that Dogon are describing, is that what enables any component to move one way or the other is the magnetism. That if a chemical reaction produces a result that sits anti-parallel to the rest of the domain it's in, it shifts one way or the other. It's not a question of permeability of the membrane. I also learned that infrared light, they tried experiments shining light through membranes. Most of the light in the normal spectrum of light is either reflected off the membrane or doesn't permeate the membrane. But infrared frequencies of light do permeate the membrane, and they also fall into the same range of frequencies that are most easily absorbed by a water molecule. So I discovered studies that show that infrared light can dissolve the molecular bonds between the hydrogens and the oxygen in a water molecule, which was a mechanism they were looking for. When it does that, the input of energy also flips the alignment of the water molecule. So now all these components are sitting anti-parallel magnetically to the rest of the membrane, and they shift out. the experiments they did required back-to-back materials. Like they're using physical materials to create the equivalent of membranes, but they have to be set back to back in very thin layers. And one of the consequences of the process of doing that with infrared light is that it leaves positive ions on one side of the surface and negative ions on the other side, which is exactly what Pollock describes for the membranes in the body. So there's pretty good evidence of what's going on is what I'm saying is going on. So then that throws the building blocks of water into this domain just inside the membrane, and they recombine there in the coherent form that creates the exclusion zone. Then the question comes of how are protons and electrons delivered to chemical reactions that happen within the organism? As I said, they're trying to describe different modes of transport for protons and electrons. And again, I say that's not a concern based on the Dogon perspective, because if you've created a superconductive situation, that's a gigantic reservoir of immediately accessible protons and electrons. All you need is a spark. You don't have to transport it, it's right there. So by deconstructing the atom, what you've done is you put it back into this circumstance that it was in before it created the atoms, before it created the molecules. You put it back to the state it was in a hydrogen atom, which is very nearly superconductive.
Thank you, Laird. I will check out, what was it, Mei Wan Ho and
They want
Pollock, did you say? On the same?
Gerald Pollock. He's a bioengineer at University of Washington.
Thank you.
And their work sits on the shoulders of previous work that was done in the early 1900s by other researchers. But they're the ones who are giving popular expression to these ideas in a way that these books are above my pay grade technologically a lot of times, but they're in the ballpark of where I can sort out what it is they're describing.
I'm sure. I'm sure. And I'm really excited about your upcoming book as well.
Well, thank you. I am too. I'm always happy to hear how people experience things. So if you ever need a sounding board for something, I would be happy to hear about it.
I have been praying for a sounding board to appear. So thank you.
And when that expresses itself phonetically, the phonetics very often align with the ones I work with. So I have sort of a community of people who fairly routinely will contact me to say, "What does this mean? This is what I received." So what are they trying to tell me?
Yeah, so wonderful. Thank you so much.
Very good questions.
Hi, just like to say thank you for Amber turning up as well. And hopefully the shopping's all gone well. I have to say, Laird, as I said, there's lots of people that are posting in comments via Twitter and also YouTube saying how much they're being blown away by this. And as Eileen was mentioning the books that she's been reading, also other people have been mentioning the same thing. So it's amazing how on point it is with the people listening. And quite a lot of them are saying it's amazing that there's only a small percentage of people that are actually getting to know about this, but now that more people like yourself are being broadcast, like we're doing it through other social media platforms and things like that, they're getting the opportunity to hear about it for the first time where they might not have even come across it.
Right. No, I appreciate the exposure for the ideas. My outlook is this material belongs to everyone the same way that the right to pick up a seed you find on the ground and plant it and expect it to grow belongs to everyone. So any proprietary approach to this material is just the wrong approach as far as I'm concerned. One of the things I like about the alternative group of researchers, the community, is that they are far more willing to cooperate with each other and share information with each other and help each other out and pass along information they've discovered they know that applies to somebody's field of research and so on. In the strictly academic field, that's not always the case. A lot of times there's more defensive turf, but this really can't come down to personal turf. Renee Guénon says that these concepts have been discovered and rediscovered many, 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 many times over the history of humanity. And it really doesn't matter who the person is who discovered it. What matters is the re-understanding and the reinvigorating of the ideas. So the book in my series that pertains most to these energetics, the two books that lay the foundation for how we get to these energetics, the most recent one is called Amma and the Spark of the Universe. And the second one, a year or two earlier, that traces down to some of the root concepts and sort of puts in context what the motivation I was talking about between the two universes of why the non-material universe would think to help out the material one, is called Seeking the Primordial. And the preceding books, which sort of move geographically, are sort of gathering all the comparative information from different cultures and sort of trying to understand a lot of the foundations that lead to this. When you get to the bottom of it, it's really a pretty simple system. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand the concepts. And the trick is to try to express things in a way that isn't laden with technical terminology that a person's not going to get. I'd rather have a metaphor that explains it to me in terms of something I already understand. So the biological aspects of this.
Sorry,
the
just
water.
spotted Myron's hand's gone up. And
Okay, go ahead.
also I'm grabbing all the different information that you're mentioning and trying to put it in multiple locations so everyone can be up to date on this one.
Okay.
Well, what I wanted to respond to was, it's interesting to me that spark of energy that you talk about, that a lot of people talk about, it's the primary catalyst for my visionary material. Now, my visionaries come from the hippocampus, and they're directly involved with epilepsy. So when I see a spark, and I have the aura, it changes the way that I relate to the world, and then the visionary stuff just comes out, and it's sort of born out of it. What's interesting to me is not that happens. What's interesting to me is that it parallels things that when I was young, I couldn't possibly have known about. There's no way that I could have known about these cosmological studies and cultures and all that stuff. But I had similar kinds of visions, and I made similar kinds of art about them, not knowing about their existence, who they were, where they came from, how they existed, or that they ever existed. And as I got older and I went to school and I read more books and I read everything I could find, I've kept finding myself everywhere, in Egypt and in the Native Americans and just everywhere, And there's an old expression, I've gone searching for myself and I have gathered myself from everywhere. And that's kind of what's happened. And the art that I've done, I've got like 7,000 pieces, are all part of this spark that I read about a lot. That term, I was just listening to Tyson last night, and Dr. Tyson, and he was talking about that spark from the cosmological, from water molecules, and how important the water molecules were in the foundation of cosmology, period, and H2O especially. And so anyway, my point was that, and I'll make it short, is that every time you say these parallels that resonate with me exactly the way I experience them in these visionary forms, is corroboration of the fact that this information is universally available.
Right.
That it's not something that, and the very fact that multiple cultures find it.
Right.
And whether they talk about it with each other or not doesn't matter. What matters is they each find it.
Right.
And then it comes out like in your books and in other books and in other discussions. And I think it's wonderful that for us who have always lived on the cusp of science, especially epileptics, we are now more involved in, at least I'm more involved in these explorations of consciousness, and finding out how people like you and other scholars have discovered these things and have made them into a language that can be communicated and be accepted by the scientific community. I used to tell my doctors all kinds of things, and they just blow it off. Like, we don't worry about that stuff. Just take your pills. Just take your pills.
Yes.
Well, that's the kind of stuff you get from them. And so it's really an amazing cohesion of the world's sciences coming together for the first time, I think, ever, because they've all been so exclusive with each other that, or you got put to death for your particular insight. But in this case, just reading about the Dogon in the last few weeks, it just reinforces what I do. I dance, I make sculptures, I have visions. The similarities are remarkable. I just wanted to make that statement.
Well, that's interesting, and it should play true. I think Kabbalism recognizes dozens of different, what they call mystic types, categories of mystics. But I'm always interested to hear how people experience things, because they come by it in so many different kinds of ways, and the ultimate key is being open to it, accepting the possibility that there's something real going on, and sincerely trying to explore what that might be. The first thing a person learns in my field of study is that there are things going on we can't explain. I have pretty much any author that I interact with has a long list of very odd circumstances that have occurred to them since they started looking into these, subjects.
Yeah, it's not conclusive findings that is so interesting. It's really the journey as much as it is the conclusions, because the conclusions seem to move. We come to a plateau, and then it moves to the next plateau of information. And I think that's pretty fascinating. I mean, I know that Einstein even said that, that black holes and things like that are spooky. Those were his words, not mine. So
right.
If a man like that says it's spooky, that means that it doesn't quite fit his cosmology, which I think is very interesting.
Right. Well, Einstein said, look, if what we experience in the universe arose by itself, that necessarily it arose from something simple.
Right.
So it's not surprising to me that it comes down to a set of dynamics that are really pretty easy to understand once you get down to what they are. But there are a whole lot of sort of corroborating details that sort of have to be filled in symbolically in various ways, and you only get at those in a correct way through comparison. Back in the earlier days, English language scholars were trying to come up with definitive versions of Shakespeare texts. I probably spoke about this last time. What had happened was, every time Shakespeare wrote a play, there were no copyright laws, so every publisher and his brother was out there sending agents out to scribble down lines to be the first one on the street to sell a version of the new play. So the world ended up with all sorts of variant copies of these plays, and the English scholars wanted to evolve, to to reconcile those and come up with a definitive text for the plays. And so the process they use is almost exactly the process I use. That by comparing them back and forth and seeing where they're in agreement with each other and where they aren't, you can triangulate in on what the original spoken word, they had all heard the same original spoken words. You can triangulate in on what those original words were or must have been, and narrow it down pretty precisely to what the version should be. And that's basically what I do. I take any given element. I start with a clear statement on the part of one of the cultures about what this symbol represents or what this myth represents or what this character in a myth represents. And then I test that against how other cultures understood the same symbolic element. And then, in addition, once we understand that we're looking at a system that seems to be scientific, then you can use the whole scientific scheme of things as sort of an anchor or sort of a framework to sort of force the material, to keep it in confines that aren't just running off wild.
Yeah, right. The good news of that is that it gives it gives support to people who have individual experiences.
Right.
I mean, it's one thing to be part of a collective, and then it's another thing to be an individual and having certain kinds of visionary experiences and having those completely, pushed aside and say, take your pills. And with the other ones that are more cultural, that there are a lot of representations of, that people are fascinated with, and they like the iconography and all the rest of it. Well, that's great, all wonderful. But the individual who's discovering the same exact things, and I'm sure that there are millions of them, not just a few.
Right.
And the more that they can connect to this universal information, the more validity they get in their own process, which happened in my case.
I wanted to mention how I came to start examining resonance states of a hydrogen atom, because that's not something that typically comes to mind. That nobody says you need to know about this.
Right.
It doesn't really come up in any of the textbooks or anything. So I was busy. I understood that the hydrogen atom was connected into this, and that I needed to get down into some of the origination effects, the energetic effects that originate an atom, but I wasn't sure how to do that. Then suddenly I come across references to a crop circle that had formed in the UK the same day. And I could see that the configuration of the crop circle was a hydrogen atom. But at the center of the hydrogen atom, they had depicted what de Broglie says is the resonance state of the hydrogen atom. It's essentially the three monopoles. So that sent me off in search of that, and that turns out to be a key piece of it. But quite often things happen to me that way, that I'll get something synchronously that will tip me in the right direction.
Yeah, there's no question. Synchronicities of all of these things is so obvious once you start opening the doors. And you're not afraid to open the doors. The synchronicities just pop.
Oh, definitely.
And
one of the best people that we've had who's been talking about that is Stephanie Quick from, basically her blog is Ghost Dog is a Mystery Box, and she's been studying synchronicities for over 20 years, which is amazing. Plus, we've been discussing that in previous podcasts. And again, Eileen's got a question.
Okay.
Thank you, Paul. Myron, so well spoken. Thank you for representing the experiencers and articulating that so well. And I love how you describe that, Laird, about the crop circle and that synchronicity. That's the way life has been going for me lately, is once I match this resonance, and I feel
Sorry to
that are
interrupt for 1 second. There's feedback coming back. I'm not sure if it's coming back from Laird, because as soon as obviously you speak, Eileen, we've got a 2 second kind of delay
Oh.
of
Yes,
your last
I
words.
had turned up my volume when Myron spoke.
Okay, right. Okay, so we need to get Myron closer to the microphone, and then at some stage we can get all these technical difficulties easily sorted. Back to yourself, Eileen.
Okay, thank you. Where was I? I have been experiencing this resonance with this intelligence. That's how I can perceive the intelligence that I then translate to the best of my ability. But I've always felt like I failed horribly at translation because I don't have a huge vocabulary, and I haven't gone, to universities and gotten degrees after degrees. Because if I had done that, I'm afraid I would have lost my ability to enter this coherent state, to give myself permission to do that, and to not be afraid to just step into this unknown and explore it and dialogue with it. I perceive my body and myself as a musical instrument in these interactions. The harmonics, the resonance. This is the way I see the crop circles, as almost like a song in the fields. How do you relate to the musical analogy? I know that so many of us experiencers are musicians at the same time, so I find that fascinating.
Yeah, no, I was a songwriter and performer during my college days. So definitely I connect to that also. And I agree, many of the people who there are connections between data processing and musicianship and these esoteric studies that happen all the time. And art, absolutely. Anybody who's connected non-materially seems to also be connected artistically, except for me. I had posted something in the chat that didn't post the way I wanted it to. I'll try to repost it. It's a link to an image that this is de Broglie's graphing of how magnetism affects the electron and the proton in an atom. Sorry to interrupt that. No, I'm always fascinated by the different ways people connect to things. I have one friend, actually a couple of friends, but one in particular whose perspective is primarily from non-material side, not the material side. She doesn't experience time linearly. And she didn't even realize until she was 12 that people were supposed to experience time linearly. She thought she was crazy. One of the personal missions my adult son and I had on our second trip to the UK was to try to introduce her to people who connect energetically in ways similar to her, so she'd realize that this is not an unusual thing. And so we had a group at Avery, and she had spent an hour and a half in a subgroup sort of walking around talking about these things. And on the way back to the tour bus, I stopped her and I said, "So how are you doing?" And she smiled and she said, "I'm not crazy," she said.
I very much relate to that. Yes. And I'm inspired to find these people and begin to communicate with them, because I've seen in the visions and the feeling visions that once we start connecting with each other, everything goes exponential. I've already experienced that in some of these groups. It's a very exciting time in that way.
also there's sort of a constancy to the theme. It's like there's one broadcast, one download broadcast that everybody seems to be getting in different ways all at the same time. You know, I originally I thought, well, gee, how is it that what I'm working on coincides with what this person just channeled?
Exactly.
And
exactly.
eventually figured out that it's not specific to me or to them. It's we're all tuning into the same broadcast.
The same song. Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. Very exciting stuff.
That is definitely true. I mean, we're all here trying to connect everybody else together to do the same kind of thing. And Ian, you've been finding the same thing, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Can I just say, Laird, your presentation tonight has been absolutely superb. I mean, they're always superb, but yeah, tonight has been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for that. And everyone else, Eileen, Myron, yeah, your contributions have been absolutely epic. So yeah, thank you very much, all three of you.
Just because I know that sometimes time is tight, how much longer do you have for questions, etc.?
How about if we go, can we go 15 more minutes?
We tend to go 4 hours, so 15 minutes is okay for us. I mean, I think everybody else is quite happy with that, aren't they?
Yes.
There's nodding heads. Ian's fallen asleep. It's all good going. I was just looking for a response from him, but he's obviously just can't get to that mic.
I just gave you one.
Thank you. Please continue.
So there's huge benefit to the fact that knowing that the system is parallel, the system of energy is parallel, is hugely beneficial because you recognize the dynamics when you see them on whatever scale it happens to be. Perceiving them on any scale gives you new insights into what you're seeing on the other scales. And it all ties back to ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic words and to Dogon words and to Buddhist and Hindu words. It's all Hinduism has sort of lost sight of some of its original phonetics, that they're time and time again. I wrote a book about Ganesha, the scientific symbolism of Ganesha, and time again there are terms in Hinduism or names of deities or whatever that when you interpret them in relation to Sanskrit don't produce a meaning that really is very meaningful to me, a definition. But when you look at it in terms of the Dogon phonetics, or in terms of, there's another language called Faroese, which is an ancient language of Orkney, that quite often words that we're told have no agreed upon etymology. If you look at the Dogon or the Faroese language, you discover there's an immediate to intuitive connection to one of the words in those languages. So having access to dictionaries is a very big help for me, a very good way of finding out information. And then it also helps that the symbols in the Egyptian language convey the meaning of the Egyptian words. The syllables in the Dogon language convey the meanings of the Dogon words. And so if I simply know how a word is pronounced, I mean, even when someone has a vivid dream, if they can tell me a phonetic term that they got in the dream, very often I can track what the meaning was. Same thing happens with UFO contacts, that things play out in terms of the same clusters of meanings that define these cosmological terms. One of the projects I'm working on right now is to try to develop what I call a list of Egyptian glyphs in derived sequence. And what I mean by that is, to the extent possible, never define a new Egyptian glyph in relation to any other Egyptian glyph I haven't already previously defined. And so what that gives me is sort of a roadmap to how do we get to this meaning of this particular glyph, so that when a person asks me, how do you know this glyph means this thing, I have ready at my hands the supporting detail of how you get to that. And I plan part of that project, I'll probably try to add information about my understanding of what the Dogon syllables represent and how those compare to the same syllables for the ancient Egyptians, because there are differences. Some of the meanings go back to the Tamil languages. Some of them go back to Turkish. almost nothing is original to ancient Greek from my perspective. That all the influences that the academics assign to Egypt, to ancient Greece, make no sense whatsoever because none of the terminology connects. The Greek terms almost all tie back to the Faroese language references. So there are so many different aspects of this. My intention is to finish the book on biology. I'm calling that book The Waters of Life. And I'm hoping that that'll be done by fall. Then after that, we'll see what kind of inroads I've made to understanding how the consciousness piece of it works. It looks like coherent water creates a kind of a blank slate in an organism. This is it creates a magnetic blank slate that works like a liquid crystal display does in like a 1990s era electronic device. That anything that impacts that surface creates an impression that lasts for a period of time, and that the suggestion is that an influence that comes in and is then reflected directly back out create two different sets of resonances against that template of a liquid crystal, and that's the equivalent of giving you sort of a 3D view through a viewer of an image. You get two different viewpoints and two different frequencies of the same thing, and cognition may come about by reconciling those two views of a thing. That's the just off the top of the head impression I have at the moment. It's also clear that the entire organism is involved in the recognition and memory of a thing. That despite injuries that have happened to people's brains, there are certain things that can be remembered without regard to which area of the brain might have been damaged. I know that brain studies are a major thing these days. I'm not conversant enough with them to be able to talk about them, but
I have to say it's one of the areas that we're all very interested in, as we've done an 8-hour chat, and we're going to be doing more on those areas because a lot of the different people that are part of the community and come in and out have been talking about what's happened to them and how they perceive consciousness with that. And it's something that we're going to really explore later on as another real in-depth one, because I think that's going to be part of a series myself. And I think you believe the same, don't you, Ian?
Yes, totally. Yeah, sorry, I'm actually rocking back on my chair unhealthily, so yeah, just a bit far away.
Always 4 legs on the floor. 2 allows you to have a problem.
I know, but it's so much more comfy. But yeah, no, well, what you're saying is absolutely correct. So yeah, having those little sessions and everything going forward, super good.
Another aspect of the biological side of things is there was a researcher named John Burke who passed away years ago, but he had done very careful research into the fertility of agricultural seeds. He noticed that traditions in many ancient cultures were to bring seeds pre-planting to certain stone structures, stone cairns, or to pyramid structures or mound structures. And the implication was that they were bringing them there to enhance the fertility of the seeds. And so he did a lengthy study of with scientific experiments with very careful controls and so forth to demonstrate that that's true. And his perception was that the form of first of all, the structures are set over deliberately set over discontinuities of energy in the ground, such as a place where there is a disconnect in electrical energy, or there's an anomaly of magnetism, or where atmospheric energy tends to be high, where storms come through, thunderstorms and so forth. And the consistent theme of this ties exactly to what I was talking about with the membranes in the body. The net effect of what's happening with the membranes in the body is that there's a separation of ions of electricity that seem to enhance the growth effects of the organism. Well, Burke found the same thing, that within these stone structures, they were creating a separation of ions of energy that were conducive to the growth of the seeds. So his perspective was that that's the energy that does that. The Dogon and Egyptian perspective is a little different from that. The Dogon and Egyptians define orbs of energy. The Egyptians called them Aku. Budge refers to them as beings of light, and he associates them with the fertility of plants. The Dogon refer to them as Tityeni. I mentioned that earlier, as to Numo. And they're also directly associated with the fertility of plants. It looks to me as if what's going on with those energetics is that they're fostering conditions that are conducive for these orbs of light to be communicated forward, and the orbs are doing the enhancement of the fertility. So that's another interesting aspect of this, because Burke was unintentionally catching images of these orbs on the pictures and the films he was taking. The explanation he
just
provides
to pause
for
you there, Myron's hands up. I've just spotted.
Go ahead, Myron.
I just wanted to say that I don't know if you know who Jacob Bronowski is or not. Dr. Bronowski had a series called The Ascent of Man. And,
Yes.
And you wrote a blog, of course, scientists.
Myron, could I ask you to just get a little bit closer to the microphone? It was a bit going out of quality at that point. Let's try it again.
Anyway, he was talking about the rise of agriculture and seeds and seed mythology and stuff like that in a book that he had written. And it was just sort of parallel to what you were just saying. This is back in the 1960s, somewhere in there,
right,
when he was writing all of this stuff. And it was just a fascinating synchronicity. You just talked about it. And I was just reading The Ascent of Man the other night, and he was talking about the rise of agriculture in human history, and how the mythology of that agriculture affected human history. And it's just a fascinating synchronicity one more time.
That's great. Well, those orbs are often seen in damp cave spaces, caverns, which, to my way of thinking, is recreating some of the circumstances of the membranes, also the aqueous membranes, that and the net effect seems to be one I attributed to infrared light doing the same thing within those caves that I believe that it's doing with the aqueous membranes, which is basically disentangling the water molecules and creating a superconductive space that connects all the way back to the root domain of energy.
You were saying, Eileen? I saw your hand go up that time very quickly then.
Yes, thank you. In the book that I mentioned, Origins of the Gods, Andrew Collins and Gregory Little speak about the orbs and these lights as plasma intelligence. Right. And also refer to the Ark of the Covenant, that plasma, that they're theorizing that this is the plasma light, or the connection, the direct conduit to that source energy. And there's you've unpacked so much here, Laird, that it's a little frustrating that we're closing now, and I know we must, but I do hope that we can continue this conversation in some way, shape, or form. Very exciting stuff.
Well, anyone should feel free to contact me by email, and I'm happy to come back and do further discussion on whatever topic anyone's interested in.
Oddly enough, we'll say yes to that, won't we, Ian?
Yes.
Oh, yes, please. Oh yeah, yeah. You can come back as many times as you want, Laird. That'd be amazing.
Thank
Tea and
you.
coffee will be provided.
Yeah.
Of course.
Well, so I should probably close here, but thank you very much for all participating today and for all the good questions, because that gives me plenty to think about myself.
Well,
And
I'm going to have to say thank you very much for turning up and obviously providing such a wealth of information. The best places to find Laird at present, I'll check with him, is on Facebook. Yes.
right.
And also, I've put in the live stream for YouTube, Eileen's website, and also Myron's website. And again, Stephanie Quick, who I mentioned before, and other people I think are relevant that have been talking this evening, as well as all the book links. And thank you very much for, again, saying that you want to come back. And again, we'll probably arrange that probably pretty quick because we got some spots. Eileen actually wants to do a guest spot to come back and do her second one, which if anyone's not listened to that particular podcast, that's on perceptionstoday.com. That's all one word, the first one. And we have many others, the same with interviews with Myron in roundtable situations and many other people. And there's lots more that's going to be going up, and the connections we're doing with people and finding it out and being able to help others go and talk to others. So instead of just being a pyramid kind of information where it all comes from one source, we try to let everyone go out and become a Venn diagram and just come back and bring in information at the same time. And we found that's really worked for us, hasn't it, Ian?
Yeah, yeah, that's worked very well at this point. Yeah, it seems to be a good format that everyone's happy with.
And we always need kind of feedback or help with these things. Like if people throw us comments anywhere on social media, or just subscribe or listen to the podcast, or just even tell us how they found these evenings, it always helps us to know what to actually bring up next, because we want to come to people with content and not just say we're going to do things on a regular basis. We want to have something that's worthwhile talking about, not just have filler.
Yeah, yeah, of course.
Great.
I would say that you've done an exceptionally good job of making sure there's no filler, Paul.
Thank you very much for saying that. It all goes down to those original people that started and pushing me to do this, and then it's really worked out so well, and we're just learning so much.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you to them and to you.
So thanks again, Laird, and this will be going out live, as we say, on YouTube, and it'll be there, but then obviously I'll make a audio version of the podcast as well and do that. So if everyone's happy with how it's been going out live, we're going to stay on for a bit longer and probably have a chat, and we'll go from there.
Good. Thank you very much. Sorry to leave you at this point.
Oh, no, it's always a pleasure.
Thank you, Laird.
Thank you,
very
lads.
much.
Thank you so much.
Just good stuff.
Yeah, thank you all very much.
Awesome. Really enjoyed
It's
that.
very, very, very cool. I'm so glad I was able to attend. Just amazing.
Oh, no, it's really superb of you all to be here. And lucky enough, I've been running around on different sites, throwing all the different information around. So that's why sometimes I'm a bit delayed on seeing things. But with the frequency that Laird's come back to us, which this now, I think, Ian, is the fourth time discussing those topics, it's been really helpful because they are very meaty subjects, which take sometimes repetitive listenings to, don't they?
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, I have his books here, but I still need to hear it from Laird before I feel prepared to wade into those waters and fully appreciate what he's trying to tell me. Yeah, it's coming together slowly, but I do appreciate having, multiple bites at the cherry, so to speak.
And it's the same with people like yourself, Myron, and Anthony Peake, and others that have got so much in depth. And like saying with yourself, Eileen, there is so much that you've got that will be of benefit to us. But obviously, we have to get the time to pick it out and be able to discuss it in an open forum. So I'd like to open it up to people if they've been finding the content of interest this evening. If anybody wants to say, again, as there's a small number of us in here, we can easily just come off mute without putting our hands up. If I hear tumbleweeds, I will come round there and find out. So I'm just going to see if I've probably got everybody else on mute due to the fact that they're all doing things and they're not close to a keyboard or can't respond. I mean, Myron, you obviously find the information relevant because of the books that you've been reading that all seem to be fitting really well with what Laird's been talking about.
Well, for me, I'm
Sorry, can I
always,
get you a bit closer?
yeah, for me, I'm always looking for new avenues of substantiation of my experiences. I'm not so interested in all of the scientific details because that's way over my head. But what's interesting how that works is when Laird talking very, very scientific language, there is something that's transmitted back to my unconscious that gives me an image. And I live on images. So if like when I hear Tyson talk about astrophysics, I see an image of everything he talks about. So even though what he talks about may be a little over my head, or it might be something that I've heard a lot of, and so I'm involved in it. But the amazing synchronicities that go on in just groups like this and podcasts that Tyson does and other people do, it's an amazing amount of information that just seems to have been lost somewhere. You know, that back in the 60s when I was young, and there was so much activity in altered states of consciousness and with consciousness itself and with what's reality and what isn't reality and all kinds of interesting, and then it sort of went away. You know, I never could figure out why it went away. Well, it really didn't go away. It went underground. That's where it went. And one thing I wanted to say was, I think that we should do a podcast on how music affects the brain.
I'm on for that because we were discussing only on Tuesday the facts of how drum vibration really does hit on everybody's level, and it makes you go into that state of, well, takes you out of your standard routine, puts you into a liminal state to make you more receptive. And again, with the organization 400 Drums, who are working with indigenous people and obviously make ceremonial drums, and they're making that archive of sound images of all the ceremonial chants and everything else that goes along with it. Once we can get all that connected, I mean, obviously, as you say, with music and that will be just a fantastic one to put together, and we can do that very soon, I think. I mean,
there's never been a time in human history that music hasn't been involved. In fact, Jacob Bronowski was talking about it in his book, Son of Man, about how music had been sort of parallel with experiences, and of course dancing and rhythm and all that. There's an old Disney film called Toot Whistle Plunk Boom, and it's about the basics of sound and how man developed musical ideas from learning bird calls and rhythms of the wind and rhythms of storms and all the rest. And then they codified that information into instruments that they just made, like a flute, which is very easy to make. A wood flute's very easy to make. And then and the creation of sound and keys later on, and most things are pentatonic scales and stuff like that. But the part of it there's a lot of technical stuff in music that probably is just as scary as physics, but for non-musicians. But the fact is that music has been the most potent catalyst for my development ever. The only thing that managed to penetrate my coma was music. I could play the piano before, and I could play the piano after the coma, but I couldn't do anything else, and I couldn't remember anyone else. I couldn't remember the world or anything else, but music, sound, I could go to the keyboard and still play the same things I played before the coma. And I don't live outside of the sound of music. It's always in me and always with me. It never leaves. I never abandon it to noise. And it seems to be fading from the cultural milieu into just noise and rhythm and some text that is, I guess, fairly pertinent. But the actual sounds of certain kinds of music, and it's a long subject, I can't go into it now, but the fact is that it's almost never discussed, and I don't understand why that's not discussed. Rhythm is discussed a lot, but rhythm, it's really tunes that people fall in love with, ideas in music that are transmitted unconsciously by sound. That people just drool over.
Especially those ones that make your hairs stand up on the back of your neck or your arms.
Yeah. I mean, if you hear the St. Matthew Passion and by Bach, and you listen to what this man wrote, you just can't believe it. You can't believe that anybody could do that. And when asked, where do you get your ideas? He said, I could never turn off the ideas. So I'll never be able to complete what I hear. I'll never be able to finish it. And his Gesellschaft of work is like massive, thousands of pieces. And anyway, there's a whole story about that. It's really kind of cute.
Oh, there's an interesting thing that I'd like to ask you and the rest of the people in the room and also out there on YouTube. The piece of music that gets to you doesn't have to actually be what people consider a happy piece of music. There's some actual symphonies which suddenly, they may sound somber and everything else, but they just connect to you in so many different ways. And it's odd because if you express it to people who don't understand music and go, oh, that piece is really just amazing to me. And they go, but it sounds so funeral-like or something like that. But that's not what the interpretation you're picking up. You're picking up something else entirely within it. So I've always found that fascinating when we have these.
I used to teach music appreciation to college students. And I was talking about what happened to Beethoven when he wrote the Fifth Symphony. He started out very pessimistic. It's a very pessimistic opening. And he was very bitter about his hearing and the fact that it was gone. And by the time the piece is over, he's written himself out of his cynicism into this glorious ending. So he could not help himself. The music was so strong in his unconscious that he wrote himself right into bliss, and he didn't want to do it. But he did it anyway because the music carried him right into it. So it's an amazing story about the power of sound. And even though it may sound dark I had students tell me, oh, that stuff sounds so weird and dark, but they don't mind looking at a film that has the same score in it. Like Kubrick uses the classical music in every film he ever did, except Spartacus. And then everybody accepts that. That's just fine because they have a visual with it. But if it's abstract, which music is mostly abstract, then they react differently. My students it was always fascinating what they could take and what they could listen to and what they couldn't listen to. And anyway, I just wanted to throw in, I think that there should be a podcast about music and what its impact is on human heart, consciousness, love, spirituality, and everything else.
I think that will go well because Ian has a lot of knowledge on sound engineering, don't you?
Yeah, I've done a fair bit of music production work, and I studied the physics of sound production and dynamics and things a while back. So Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea, Myron. I think music's super important all the time, especially the super depressing, miserable stuff. That's the best stuff, let's face it.
But if we get enough people and bring them in, those that experience it, etc., as well, and even people who are not emotionally moved by music and have the full spectrum of types that are there and have that conversation. For example, we could even set up, say, a 3 or 4 piece of music of different variations that we should say to people, have a listen to this. Does this, what's it do for you? Come and talk about it afterwards. And that would be a way to go on these things, which I think, as I see nodding heads, makes sense to people.
Yes, I think that's a great idea, to give examples of music and see what, what are you feeling? Asking the question, how does this make you feel? So I'm in agreement with Myron about doing something like that. I know that in relating to something Myron shared as well, when I was doing groups before COVID hit, I would play some cello music by Adam Hurst or David Darling music as well. And it's so, cello is my favorite instrument. It's so rich and deep and resonant. And some people just were not able to, relate to it or listen to it for too long because it made them begin to feel deeply, right? And that's not where we want to go, right? We want to stay up here in mental land and relate in that way. And so it wasn't popular with some of the people in the group, but for me, I was just loving, being witness to the reactions and the responses in people when they would hear this beautiful, haunting, deeply resonating music in their bodies.
Well, talking of that, I've put one.
Just to add, some would just love it like I do. So it's an interesting thing to observe.
Oh, definitely. I'm not sure if people know this one I've put into the chat zone. I'm going to mispronounce it entirely, but it's Gorecki's Symphony No. 3, The Sorrowful Songs.
Yeah, I know it.
That is just amazing as well. That's the kind of thing.
Okay.
And again, Ambo, welcome. Sorry, Myron.
What's interesting is that when Debussy wrote Prelude to the Afternoon of the Faun, he based it on an interval that the church had would burn you at the stake for writing. That shows you how powerful music was at one time in the world. That just because you write this C to G sharp interval, it's called an augmented fourth.
Did not know that was that kind of offense then.
Oh yeah, that was a death penalty offense by the church. No question about it. And you won't find it in any of the music of the Middle Ages. Well, it didn't exist really anyway, but you won't find it in the context of anything that has to do with that's around the church. It just doesn't exist. But Debussy's whole piece, Prelude to the Afternoon of the Faun, is based on that interval. The whole piece is based on that interval. It's not arbitrary or accidental, and it's absolutely beautiful. And it's a ballet on top of that. But that interval is the whole structure that the piece is based on. There's a wonderful lecture by Leonard Bernstein called the Harvard Lectures that I highly recommend to anybody who loves music. I mean,
oh, definitely. I'm just going to have to interrupt as Eileen's just going to have to go. And obviously she'd like to say thank you to everybody that's been here. It's good to see you. And we will obviously talk again.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have absolutely loved this. Thank you for continuing on with the good work, Paul, and for your contributions, Myron. We're so much alike. We have to talk sometime.
I get it.
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's wonderful. And Ian, thank you. Myro, we didn't hear from Miro, and Amber. Hi.
Amber,
probably-
quickly, you can come off mic now. off the mute
Yeah,
now.
real quickly before you leave, I mean, I was just going to say, because I've been listening on and off, and your energy is amazing. I feel like this aura, or whatever you want to call it, right? I'm just like, this whole time, just like, I don't know, everything that you say, and just even when you're just sitting there, like not saying anything, I don't know, I feel like some very strong, just like super positive, almost like a healing type of energy. So it's been a pleasure just being in the same, virtual room as you.
Well, thank you so much, Amber. That's quite lovely of you to say. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been lovely to see you again, Eileen.
Yes, you
hope
too.
to see
Ian.
you again soon. And
Yes.
yeah, Amber's right. You do put out some gorgeous energy.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm glad that Lori, my friend, could join us today. Maybe she'll be a regular. And I actually have an appointment with her, so we'll probably both be.
Could she? Well, you don't have to come off mute. I would just like to get a quick sense check on how you found today.
Oh yeah, it was very, very interesting. Thanks so much. There's a lot of stuff that was said that I have questions about, but I don't even know how to pose the questions, like about the water, and that we're made up of so much water, and how does that all relate to this? And it's just very fascinating. Thank you.
Perfect.
And Eileen, before you go too, I wanted to just say, thank you so much for saying like the experiencers, like you were calling, yourself and Myron, like, the experience. And I love how you said, you're like, I don't have like a degree. I didn't go and do all, these things, but, and that's because I've been, invited in here, and this is my second time joining. And I'm just sitting here like, man, I don't have any credentials like to be qualified to talk about consciousness. But when you said experience, it's true. Like some of us just experience things in a way that others find very fascinating, and we all find that.
That's right. Don't
that.
let any of this hold you back. I just want to stress that. Just join in, jump in right where you are.
Oh, definitely.
Because,
it's all gut feeling. Don't try and go against it.
So many of us have held ourselves back because of this, and this is something that I've been testing the waters for many years now, and stepping out, even though I don't have any credentials. There's nothing about me, image-wise, in this world that would say that I have a right to speak. Well, I do have a right to speak. I have that authority within me. I have the direct experience, and that is great authority as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. So good, Amber.
Thank you.
You just keep showing up and share who you are and what you've learned, what you know.
Oh, definitely. And Laurie, thank you for saying that. There's also one in that invite. There was 23 links to podcasts for Laird Scranton by other podcasters, but we also have a series, and the first one, which is over 3.5 hours, is on the actual podcast, which you can find on any of the podcast apps, which quite a lot of people have come back with very good positive feedback on all the ones that are up there, which is fantastic, I feel. So
Great.
And again, it's the community sharing and bringing more connections and just joining those wonderful dots, isn't it, Ian?
Indeed. Yeah. That's bang on the nail head, I think.
And the community is just getting bigger, which is superb.
And Amber, the universe doesn't mind who it gives itself to. If in the Bible it says, if you seek, you'll find. And the truth is, if you go looking for truth, it'll find you. It's standing right there next to you, and that's for anybody. I mean, it's universally available. It does not block itself from anyone, ever. We block it, but it isn't blocked, ever. It's always available and always ready to give you whatever you need.
That's so true. What do you call it?
Go ahead. I was just talking about universal consciousness is what I was talking about.
Oh yeah. I wrote that down last time we talked, because that was like a term that I've been looking up since then, because I love that. But I was going to say, when you said that you experienced what was being said earlier in a visual way, I loved that, because a lot of what was being talked about seemed over my head, and it was like kind of a new subject or a new way of looking at things, and a lot of it was a little scientific. So I was sitting here like listening and not fully comprehending the exact words that he was saying, but for some reason I kept listening anyways. And I was like, I don't know what it is, but I kind of like almost, I was resonating with it almost like on a vibrational level, if that makes sense. But when you said that you were visually seeing things, I was like, oh, like that's like, I think I was experiencing it with different senses other than just my brain acknowledging, you know, the science that he was trying to explain. So I think that's really cool that like there was something about the way he was saying and what he was saying that I guess I recognized on a deep level was true and important for me to hear. And so I thought that was really cool. And I was also listening to what you were saying about music. And you know, we're talking about how a lot of people are musicians, and I will say, like, I am no musician. I cannot sing. I played the flute when I was 6th grade, but that was it. But as I was listening to y'all, I realized I experienced a lot of things as musical tones or melodies. And in my dreams, I was like, I remembered, I actually, like, in my dreams, I end up writing songs and performing them for people. And I have no idea why. And unfortunately, when I wake up, I try to write it down. But the thing is like, I can't usually remember enough of it. And also, I don't know how to read music or write music, right? So I'm like, I have this melody, but I can't sing and I can't like, so how do I get it out, right? But it's just very interesting that once you started talking about it, I realized that music and it on a deep level, it is a way that I experience a lot of things. And just because I can't, you know, in my mind, like sing it or like turn it into music for others to hear, somehow I still know it and I can still like receive it. Even one time I took a picture of, this is going to sound very out there, but I took a picture of like a crystal grid I have, and I sent it to some of my spiritual friends, you know, and one of them said, hey, your crystals, like she said it specifically, like the purple one, it has something to tell you. So I would like maybe meditate with it or something. I'm like, okay, like that's cool. So I grab it and I'm like, okay, like what is it going to tell me? And I literally was holding it, meditating, and I heard a song. And I wrote down this entire song, and I even got out a recorder and started recording myself because the melody and the tune was something I hadn't heard before, but it was beautiful. And I was like, I know I'm not doing it justice, but maybe one day this is supposed to mean something. And it was about the planet and how the planet's like suffering and stuff. And I was like, whoa, that's not something that I usually get into. So like this crystal is like telling, it was just very magical kind of experience. So I think I love that idea of music as a topic, because it, even for those of us who don't consider ourselves musicians, I think when we really start to think about it, music still does play like a super important role in this whole thing we call life, you know?
Oh,
It
definitely.
Always has throughout human history. So there's got to be a reason. You know,
Just thinking about it, maybe if we all think of, you know, several songs or some patterns of sounds which will be worthwhile exploring with others, and once we've got those sounds together, we give people like a 2-week lead time to say, right, you've got this time to listen to these 5 songs, then we're going to come together, we're going to have this discussion, and we'll see where it goes. I think that'll work.
Yeah, that might work.
Welcome, Brad. How are you doing? Brad, unfortunately, might be listening or driving or doing other things, not running towards the unmute button at this present time. I always love this.
There's a book, Amber, by Oliver Sacks about the brain and music, and it's fascinating. Maybe Paul can put it in his share the book thing. But it's a great book. I mean, and it even deals with popular music and classical music and non-Western music and all kinds of things. And you know, such a damn scholar, you know, that and he loved music a lot, and he's such a great neurologist that he talks about how it affects almost everything the brain does. It's a fascinating book. So if you can find it, I think it's probably online somewhere. But It's a pretty well-known book. Maybe Paul, you've put it in the.
Yep,
your-
I'm working on that right now. Taking me time to just find the little bit of links and stuff. It's called Musicophilia. I'm just getting it set up with the
There,
actual
there are people
link.
who hear music that aren't musicians, like you were saying, and that dream music, and they're not musicians. And then they want to write them down, and like you said, you sang it, right? You sang the melody. Well, it's wonderful that you remembered. That's kind of an amazing thing, just that you remembered. But a lot of great composers dream their pieces. It isn't that it's spontaneous like that, but of course it's very construction oriented. Large orchestral works are very constructed. But the ideas come from the unconscious. And anything that comes from the unconscious is a kind of universal language. And after all, music has evolved just like everything else in the world.
Almost definitely. I mean, I found it. It's now down in the major chat section, which is good. What I would like to say is that all those people that are listening on YouTube, I'm now closing this down, and thank you very much for watching. And we will be in the Zoom room if you want to continue going to have a conversation. So I'm just going to end that particular